All right, good morning. I'm Dorinda Dahlmeyer. It's my privilege to be president of the Bartram Trail Conference, and also my privilege to welcome such a hearty crowd on a Saturday morning to come here. Before we begin, I want to recognize the sudden passing of Joel Fry, who epitomized the generous scholar. He seemed to inhabit the mind of William Bartram somehow across the centuries. And we miss Joel's presence here with us today and honor all that he's meant to the Bartram Trail Conference. So. Amen. And it is my pleasure to introduce Kathryn Braund, who is now retired, but formerly served as Hollifield Professor of Southern History, at Auburn University. Among her many contributions to the field of Southern history are as author of Deerskins and Duffels, The Creek Indian Trade with Anglo-America from 1685 to 1815. It is very prominently cited on my bookshelf, and it's my go-to book. And also a number of books on William Bartram and his relationship with the Southern Indians. And most recently, his book, The Attention of a Traveler, Essays on William Bartram's Travels and Legacy. She's a past president of the Bartram Trail Conference and is an assiduous collector of things Bartram for our archives, which are held in Montgomery, and has been particularly interested in the role of the early founders of the Bartram Trail Conference and bringing their lives to us. Today, she's focusing on the survey of the new purchase and one of Bartram's first forays into this new territory, which many of us now call home. So it's my pleasure to welcome Kathryn Braund.
Okay. Thank you, Dorinda. And it's my pleasure to be here today and to see so many old Bartram friends and meet new people. It really is a wonderful conference. And oh, louder. Can you hear me now? Okay. There's no feedback though. Okay. Can you hear me now? Is there feedback? A little. I don't want any feedback from the audience, especially you Florida people. Okay. All right. Well, you think it's August and whatever year this is, 2023, but it's not. It is May 1773, and our boy William has arrived in Augusta, Georgia for one of the most important conferences in the history of the Creek Nation and the colony of Georgia. We have in attendance the leading headmen and warriors of both the Creek and Cherokee Indians, and their purpose was profound. They were there to cede land to Georgia to clear away the entire national debts of both Indian nations to their Indian traders and merchants. Now, the official records of the Congress are virtually non-existent, and this is interesting because every other Indian conference that the British had, there's a voluminous transcript of who's present, what the ceremonies were, who the speakers were, and so on. Not for this one. But thankfully, Bartram had a front row seat, and he is an invaluable source of information about the proceedings, and he provided a most enlightening account of the first day of the Congress. And that was when the Creek Indians discovered their neighbors, the Cherokee Indians, were ceding land that belonged to them. Now, I want to quote Mr. Bartram extensively, for no one can do better than his firsthand account, and you can find it in Travels. And it's wonderful, wonderful Bartram writing. He wrote, "The first day of the convention opened with settling the preliminaries, one article of which was a demand on the part of the Georgians to a territory lying on the Tugelo River and claimed by both tribes, which it seems the Cherokees had, previous to the opening of the Congress, privately conveyed to the Georgians, unknown to the Creeks. Which the Georgians mentioning as a matter settled, those Georgians, the Creeks demanded in council on what foundation they built that claim, saying they had never ceded those lands, the Georgians answered that they bought them of their friends and brothers, the Cherokees. The Creeks, nettled and incensed at this, a chief and warrior started up and with an agitated and terrific countenance, frowning menaces and disdain, fixed his eyes on the Cherokee chiefs, asked them what right they had to give away Creek lands, calling them old women and old women, and saying they had long ago obliged the Cherokee to wear the petticoat, a most humiliating and degrading stroke. In the presence of the chiefs of the whole Muskogee Confederacy, of the Choctaws, principal men and citizens of Georgia, Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, in the face of their own chiefs and citizens, and amidst the laugh and jeers of the assembly, especially the young men of Virginia, their old enemy and dreaded neighbor. But humiliating as it really was, they were obliged to bear the stigma passively and even without a reply. And moreover, Bartram continues, those arrogant bravos and usurpers, the Creeks, carried their pride and importance to such lengths as even to threaten to dissolve the Congress and return home unless the Georgians consented to annul the secret treaty with the Cherokees and receive that territory immediately from them as acknowledging their exclusive right of alienation, which was complied with. Now, let's unpack that just a bit. Number one, the Cherokees and Georgians had attempted an end run around the Creeks and they were caught red-handed and the Creeks were not having it. It bears pointing out that the Georgians had done an end round around British Indian policy, and it had required Governor James Wright to go and lobby the Crown to receive special permission for this highly irregular deal, which was for the Indians to give the land to the colony of Georgia. They would sell it, and the proceeds of the sale would then repay the debts of the merchants. So the whole thing is highly irregular. The Indian superintendent had been against it, said it's going to be trouble, but it proceeded. Thank you, Sir James Wright. Two, concerning petticoats and old woman, this is a great bit of gender history here, because it was indeed, as Bartram knew, a most humiliating and degrading stroke for men, warriors, essentially to be stripped of masculinity and called women, not just women, old powerless women, and they have a special place in societies, and we could talk about that in private if you like. But anyway, amid the laughter and the jeers, the Cherokees had kept quiet, bearing, as Bartram said, the stigma passively, for the Creeks had won that territory from them in a previous war in the 1750s. And even caused them to abandon a few of their towns. So everyone, including the Georgians, knew what was going on. The Cherokees did too. Now, Bartram cast the Creeks as arrogant bravos and usurpers. I kind of like that. I think they did too, which was a pretty apt characterization of them as far as the Georgians were concerned. But the Creeks had a point, and the speaker, who was probably the head warrior of Coweta, the largest Creek town, did a very fine job, I think, in presenting the Creek view of the situation, which was widely held among the Creeks. So it's a wonderful bit of history preserved by William Bartram there. Now, that was some opening to a conference in which matters were supposedly settled. They just met to sign the treaty and agree on the boundary. Now, Bartram people tend to think of Harper's edition of Travels, the naturalist edition, as the Bartram Bible, and it is, but it is not infallible. By the way, that's Francis Harper sitting on his porch, and that house, if you go to Google and look at his address, is still there and looks exactly the same. And I think this was probably when he was in the process of editing Travels due to the date. Now, when Harper edited Travels, he turned to John R. Swanton for commentary on Bartram's Indian information. Swanton was a leading anthropologist with a doctorate from Harvard University, and he conducted extensive field work among the numerous tribes for the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology. He published widely, numerous volumes on the Creeks and other southeastern tribes. And while his research is exhaustive and he's a widely cited authority, he failed to consult British records, the documentary record. And so he formed sometimes erroneous conclusions about Indian matters that Bartram spoke about. Now, as to Bartram's account of the August 1773 Augusta Conference in 1773, Swanton wrote, and I'm going to quote again, Bartram seems to have misinterpreted entirely the attitude of the Cherokee and the Creeks toward each other. The former were by no means submissive to the latter, whom they had defeated signally and pushed out of their former territories on the Tennessee and upper valley of the Coosa. Well, maybe in the 16th century, but this is the 18th. Swanton wrote, one suspects Bartram had transferred the common story regarding relations between the Iroquois and the Delaware out of its proper setting. Oh dear, and that's a footnote in Harper's edition of Travels. In this case, Swanton was dead wrong and Bartram was right, as he was about so many things. It was widely known that Cherokees had lost his territory, and we know that Bartram's account of the proceedings are accurate because what the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs wrote and what James Wright wrote reported basically the same information to the home government after the Congress. Not quite as eloquently as Bartram and not quite as detailed, but John Stewart, who was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, wrote home that the cession was obtained with much difficulty, which is a master stroke of understatement, and the British didn't get all the land they requested. And Georgia was hot about that because they wanted lands on the Oconee. In fact, John Stewart reported the Creeks positively refused to give up any lands on Oconee River, which laid the Cherokees under the disagreeable necessity of making good the deficiency by advancing the boundary northward 20 miles nearer their towns than they had first proposed, which they did with vast reluctancy and strong expressions of concern. I love that vast reluctancy. They had to pry it from their hands. But yeah, the Georgians needed enough land to sell to pay off these debts. And if the Creeks aren't giving up the land and saying, we have a right to this land and we're not giving it up, then the Cherokees had to do a little more because they were the ones who really got the ball rolling with this thing. Now, as a result of the widespread opposition to what was essentially a forced cession, which was to the Indians, pay your debts or we're not going to trade with you anymore, nearly 2 million acres of Indian real estate moved to the Georgia side of the map. I'll add that in addition to the dissolution of the national debt of each tribe, the Indians received, as Bartram noted, substantial goods, including gunpowder, pack horses of gunpowder, for the purchase of their land, and that's what it's called, the new purchase. Both the Creeks and the Cherokees at the end of the thing were disgruntled. They were disgruntled at each other, at their traders, at the British, at the Georgians, and especially at the numerous settlers who had already poured into these newly ceded lands. In fact, were already jumping the newly marked border. So the situation was fraught with the promise of trouble after the Congress. And in Travels, Bartram, being Bartram, tried to tie it up nicely, and he wrote, the treaty concluded in unanimity, peace, and good order. Well, it concluded without outright fistfights and warfare, but Bartram reported more candidly to Fothergill that the proceedings, not terminating entirely to the satisfaction of the parties on either side of the question, the superintendent told me he thought it not altogether safe to go then into the Indian countries, but instead suggested Bartram go with the party appointed to survey the cession. And so it was that Bartram's foray into the Creek and Cherokee lands, which is where Fothergill wanted to go to get the decent shrubs and trees for the English gardens, was delayed. Now, where was all this? Here is a map. You can see the new purchase cession was actually two parts, and the part we're most concerned with is that northern part, which is where we are. I get my pointer up there, and the Creeks ceded this, but you can see there are no lands along the Oconee there, and that is where Bartram was going. And one of the goals of the British superintendent's office was to negotiate a marked boundary with the Creek Indians. Very little of it actually gets marked. This dotted line is where the treaty stipulated with the various tribes. But Georgia was intent on expanding. And this is the map that was the result of the survey that Bartram travels with, and particularly on this part of the survey. Now, Bartram says that the northern party that he went with consisted, and he went because the land was supposed to be more interesting than the Pine Barrens further to the south. And typical to Bartram, he doesn't say exactly how many people went. He said 70 or 80, and then another place 90. So a lot of people, and fair enough, they were coming and going. But you had the surveyors, interpreters, Indian deputies with their followers. There were pack horsemen, there were hunters, guides, and Bartram says a number of people who went to view the lands, i.e. the land speculators. Now, the survey was not without controversy either, or as Bartram put it, warm controversy. That's like vast reluctancy. It's a master of understatement. And one I'd like to focus on happened near the headwaters of the Little River at a place called the Buffalo Lick, which is a site fraught with controversies of all sorts. And I think Brad is going to cover those. So I'm going to quote Bartram again, because Bartram provided the readers of Travels with a remarkable instance of Indian sagacity. So here's what happened. And Brad, you probably have this map, but this is maybe you can get your bearing of where we're talking about. But as far as the Buffalo Lick, it's one of those Bartram sites that people have been arguing about since Bartram left there. All right, so what is Bartram? Oh yeah, this is even better. What slide am I supposed to be to? Okay, we got one more. So this is the survey detail, and this is where all this happens. Can you see the Great Buffalo Lick right there? Okay, and there it is, and they're going around. Okay, all right. So the surveyor, Bartram writes, having fixed his compass on the staff and about to ascertain the course from our place of departure, just as he had determined on a point, and you can bet it was to the west, the Indian chief came up and, observing the course he had fixed upon, spoke and said it was not right, but that the course to the place was so-and-so, holding up his hand and pointing. The surveyor replied that he himself was certainly right, adding that the little instrument, pointing to the compass, told him so, and that it could not err. The Indian answered he knew better, and that the little wicked instrument was a liar, and he would not acquiesce in its decisions, since it would wrong the Indians out of their land. The argument now reached such a crescendo that the Creeks were about to leave and put a halt to the survey, and I'll leave it for you to read Bartram's account of that, when the head of the expedition, Edward Bernard of Augusta, agreed to dispense with the use of the compass and allow the Creeks to lead the survey, for which they would receive payment for their efforts, so more goods. So Bartram noted in Travels that the surveyor was wrong. And years later, the University of Georgia's Lou DeVorsey, a BTC founding scholar and leading historical cartographer of the Southeast during his long and distinguished career, tells us why the little wicked instrument was a liar. There are a number of magnetic anomalies in the general vicinity of the Buffalo Lick. So the surveyor and his instrument were wrong, and perhaps not due to ill intent, but maybe too much trust on a faulty instrument. All right, so we'll give him some slack. However, this is, I've annotated this map, and you see my highlighted line. And this, I don't know if you can see under my highlight, there's a very faint line here and a notation by Governor Wright. And what he says, I intend, if possible, to get this line altered and run straight as marked, a parcel that would take in about 30,000 acres. So the Georgians weren't finished, and I don't know if that was a magnetic anomaly or not, but yeah, the Georgians were after the land. All right, well, Bartram's experiences were exciting, but not all of them were that kind of exciting dust-ups, as it were, but there were some. While he was on the survey, he observed Cherokees catching fish, he discovered several plants, he learned a lot about the Indians, and he saw a good deal of the country. But the end of the survey did not result in peace. Two of the young Cherokees with whom Bartram had traveled for part of this survey were brutally murdered on their way homes in cold blood. And although the Cherokees were able to patch things up and prevent all-out war, It did not happen that way with the Creeks. They were so agitated by the manipulation and attempted graft that the British decided to delay payment of the goods due them, that gunpowder, thinking, let's let them simmer down before we give them gunpowder. And that delay in the promised goods added angry fuel to an already hot fire, as did border jumpers. And on Christmas Day, a series of murders were perpetrated by a number of young Creeks in which numerous Georgians were killed, two different families on two different occasions. And the circumstances behind that are very complex, but needless to say, Georgia fully expected the Creek Indians to come swooping down and go into all-out war with them. All trade was stopped, an embargo was imposed. It was a very tense situation. So what was a botanist to do? Bartram headed to Florida in his fabled adventures there. Only later did he manage to re-enter the heartland of the Southeast and forge his way to the Mississippi River. His experiences on the Georgia Creek frontier in 1773 are often overlooked for a number of reasons. That footnote by Swanton dismissing his testimony, I think, is certainly one reason, as well as those Florida frolics and alligators, which are so attention-grabbing. Moreover, Bartram provides a summary of the conference in his narrative part. Travels is in 4 parts. So he provides part of it there, but the rest of it is stuck in part 4, where he discusses the Creek Indians. And so it's chopped up. And I think that scattered evidence has sort of lessened the effect of it. Now, Bartram's adventures and expert commentary on events are of incalculable value to historians. His testimony about the events during the Congress and the survey expedition are unique and provide really the most detailed record of the conference outside the treaty and a couple of summary letters by Crown officials and the governor of Georgia. His experiences at the conference and the survey party brought him into contact with some of the region's leading and most knowledgeable citizens, notably George Golphin, who would very shortly become the American representative to the Creeks, and John Stewart, the British superintendent. These men opened doors and opportunities for Bartram and supported his travels. They also were valuable informants, and a lot of the information he has about the Southeast and places he obtained from them, and particularly from Golphin's employees, and they provided background information he incorporated into his work. He provided not only commentary about the Indians in these procedures, but notes information about the Georgia landscape at the time on the survey detail, particularly in his report to Fothergill, the extent of colonial settlement, some of which was where it shouldn't be. And so I think this early part of travel certainly deserves more attention and is certainly worth reading. And I hope you'll do that when you get a chance, not only for its historic value, but for the sheer joy of Bartram's wonderfully descriptive writing. Thank you.
No questions in Zoom.
Okay.
So are you saying that you think maybe this excursion in the sort of really just because of the uprising in the north, and that maybe he never even.
Oh, I think he intended to go to Florida. There's no doubt about that. He loved Florida and he wanted to get there, and he got there under sort of suspicious circumstances because there was an embargo. The traders were not supposed to be going, and they were slipping into East Florida anyway. So I think he wanted to go there, and this was a good excuse. But on the other hand, he certainly could not go into the Cherokee Nation or the Creek Nation at that point. All the deerskin traders had left the towns. Georgia had stopped trade, so it was just impossible to get to the Mississippi, where he also really wanted to go. Yes, ma'am. The question is, were the negotiations conducted in English? It was multilingual. The way those negotiations went is that the dignitaries would stand up. In this case, it would have been, and I should have pointed out that first slide was a little powder horn from a Congress held in Florida, the Piccolata Congress of 1765. That powder horn has an interesting story behind it. The dignitaries would stand up, introduce themselves, And then there would be Indian ceremonials as well, but the Indian speeches would have been in Muskogee or Cherokee language and then translated. So these were very long, drawn out proceedings in which, you know, you'd have a sentence or two and then it would be translated. And the translators had to be approved by both the native people and the government, and had to be trusted translators. And there should have been, and always was, a British official who was writing these things out in longhand in a very detailed manner. So they were long, cumbersome. They involved the gift exchange, smoking peace pipes and that sort of thing, even Indian dances in some case. So you know, Bartram could have done us a lot better than he did. I mean, I'm happy for what we have, but there certainly was, he was witness to an incredible event. Yes.
So that was Augustus 9 years after.
Yeah, I did history. Let's see, 65 and 9. Yeah. So there are a number of conferences and congresses, as we really call them, with the Creeks in the post-war. By post-war, I mean the 7 Years' War. The first was in 1763 Congress at Augusta, which involved all the major southeastern tribes, including the Chickasaw, Choctaw, the Cherokee, and I think a few Catawba were there. And there were like 700 people at that one. But that was the first one. And then to negotiate that boundary line that I showed you, and that was Lou DeVorsey's work as well. He spent his career working on that. There were conferences in East Florida in 1765, in Mobile and Pensacola with the Creeks and the Choctaw in 1765. And then there were later conferences. There was one in 1768 at Augusta to negotiate trade prices and things. And so there were several big meetings, but this was the biggest one since 68. I think Bartram says there were 300 Creeks and 100 Cherokees there. And so it wasn't quite as big as the 1763 conference. Yes.
How big was that?
Well, that's a matter of interest, because to get the Indians, and this is for any of you who are in business, you will understand the problem here. To get the Indians to agree to this, some of the Cherokee traders said, "You give us this land, and we'll burn our account books." And so they burned their account books, and then, well, how do you prove how much the debt was? Which is a really frustrating thing for people who study the deerskin trade, because a lot of those things were destroyed. I mean, time destroyed a lot of them anyway. There are virtually none of these account books left. But I don't really know. There is chatter back and forth between, right? They had a figure in mind that I don't recall or remember. But they knew they needed a lot of money. And then here's what else comes into play, and that is the American Revolution. Because none of these people, like George Golphin, who was the big merchants who were the main ones holding the bag, these aren't deerskin traders who got the crown to do this. These are the leading merchants of Carolina and Georgia who are deeply in debt and who worked with Wright. And so the notion was, when this land was sold, they needed X, you know, they had figured it out. But then the American Revolution comes along, this incident with the White Sherrill murders, that sort of has throws a sort of a damper on land sales, let's say, because the whole Georgia frontier was had. So it didn't work out to benefit anyone really in the end. But I don't know the figure.